The sun beat down mercilessly on Rebecca Crawford's back as she bent over her final jar of strawberry preserves. Her calloused hands trembling from exhaustion and hunger she would not admit to anyone, least of all herself. The year was 1878, and Riverside, Kansas, had seen better days, though perhaps not as catastrophic as the days Rebecca had endured since her husband Thomas died from a rattlesnake bite 2 years prior, leaving her with a small homestead, mounting debts, and a determination fierce enough to rival the prairie winds that howled through the gaps in her barn walls. She set the jar carefully on the wooden table she had dragged into town that morning, arranging it with the others in neat rows that sparkled like rubies in the late afternoon light. The main street of Riverside was dusty and worn, lined with establishments that had seen their share of boom and bust as the railroad pushed westward. Rebecca had positioned herself near the general store, hoping to catch folks on their way in or out, though so far the traffic had been disappointingly sparse. At 26, Rebecca still maintained the bearing of the schoolteacher she had been before marriage, her auburn hair pinned back severely, her simple gray dress clean despite its patches and faded color. She had learned to meet the world with a level gaze, neither apologizing for her circumstances nor inviting pity. The preserves were excellent, she knew that much. Her mother had taught her the recipes before succumbing to cholera during Rebecca's 16th year, and she had perfected them through countless batches made in the small kitchen of her homestead. "How much for a jar?" a weathered woman asked, pausing with a basket over her arm. "20 cents, Rebecca replied, keeping her voice steady though her heart hammered. She needed to sell at least 10 jars today to have enough to pay the week's interest on the loan she owed to Howard Finch, the banker whose patience was wearing thinner than tissue paper. The woman examined a jar of blackberry preserves, holding it up to the light. "I can make my own for less. But you have not made it yet, and winter is coming," Rebecca said quietly, "and I promise you will not taste finer preserves anywhere in Kansas." The woman sniffed but set down 2 dimes and took the jar, walking away without another word. Rebecca pocketed the coins, feeling their weight like a small victory. 9 more jars. She needed 9 more sales. The afternoon stretched on. She sold 2 more jars to a rancher's wife who remembered Rebecca from before Thomas's death. Their transaction accompanied by sympathetic looks Rebecca pretended not to see. A traveling salesman bought 1 jar of apple butter, and a young couple bought 2 jars of peach preserves, as they whispered excitedly about their upcoming wedding. The sun was sinking lower, painting the street in shades of amber and gold, when Rebecca heard the sound of hooves approaching at a leisurely pace. She looked up to see a cowboy riding a paint horse, his figure silhouetted against the dying light. He dismounted with an easy grace, tying his horse to the post outside the general store before turning to survey the street. He was tall, Rebecca noticed, with broad shoulders and the weathered look of a man who spent his days under the open sky. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could see a strong jaw and the suggestion of dark hair. He wore typical cowboy attire, well worn but clean, his boots scuffed from hard use. There was a certain quality to the way he moved, confident but not arrogant, purposeful without rushing. The cowboy's gaze landed on Rebecca's table, and he changed direction, walking toward her with measured steps. As he drew closer, she could see his eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the prairie. He appeared to be in his early 30s, his face lined by weather and work but handsome in a rugged way that made Rebecca's breath catch unexpectedly. "Good evening, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. His voice was deep and carried a hint of Texas in its drawl. Those preserves for sale? Yes, sir. 20 cents a jar, Rebecca replied, squaring her shoulders and meeting his eyes directly. He picked up a jar of strawberry preserves, examining it with an attention that seemed unusual for such a simple transaction. You make these yourself? I did. Every jar on this table. What flavors do you have? Rebecca gestured to the array. Strawberry, blackberry, peach, apple butter, plum, and raspberry, all made from fruit I grow on my homestead or gather from the wild patches along the river. The cowboy set down the strawberry preserves and picked up the blackberry, then the peach, studying each one as though it contained secrets. How many jars do you have here? Rebecca counted quickly, though she already knew. 32 jars remaining. And how much would that be total? Rebecca blinked, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon. 32 jars at 20 cents each. That would be $6.40 if my arithmetic is correct. He looked at her then, and something in his expression made her heart flutter strangely. I will take them all. All of them. Rebecca heard the disbelief in her own voice and tried to temper it. That is quite a lot of preserves, sir. Are you provisioning for a large outfit? Something like that, he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a leather wallet. He counted out $6.40 in coins and bills, placing them on the table. Do you have a way to transport them, or shall I help you load them? Rebecca stared at the money, her mind racing. This was more than she had hoped to make in a week of selling. I have a wagon just there, she managed, pointing to the small buckboard parked in the shade of the general store. But, sir, are you certain? That is a considerable purchase. I am certain, madam. He began carefully picking up jars, cradling several in his arms. Lead the way to your wagon. Rebecca gathered the remaining jars, her hands shaking slightly as she walked to the buckboard. The cowboy followed, and together they loaded the preserves into a crate she had brought for that purpose. As they worked in silence, Rebecca could not help stealing glances at him. There was something gentle in the way he handled the jars, respectful of her work, and she found herself curious about this stranger who would buy all her preserves without hesitation. When the last jar was loaded, the cowboy straightened and looked at her with that same steady gaze. Might I ask your name, madam? Rebecca Crawford, she replied, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. And yours, sir? Xander Garrett, he said, extending his hand. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mrs. Crawford. Rebecca hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was firm but careful, his palm calloused from years of rope and rain. It is Miss Crawford now, she heard herself say, then wondered why she had offered that information. I am widowed. Something flickered in Xander's eyes, sympathy perhaps, but not pity. I am sorry for your loss, Miss Crawford. Thank you. Rebecca withdrew her hand, suddenly aware of how long they had been holding the handshake. And thank you for your purchase, Mr. Garrett. You have helped me considerably today. Will you be selling again? He asked. More preserves, I mean. I will. I have another batch ready in a few days if the weather holds. I come to town every week, usually on Thursday afternoons. Xander nodded slowly, as though committing this information to memory. Then perhaps I will see you next Thursday, Miss Crawford. I expect I will be needing more preserves. 32 jars will not last you a week, Rebecca said, unable to keep the hint of amusement from her voice. Perhaps not, Xander agreed, and she thought she detected the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. But they are exceptional preserves, and exceptional things are worth returning for. Before Rebecca could formulate a response to that peculiar statement, Xander touched his hat brim again and walked back to his horse. She watched him mount and ride away, heading west out of town, the hoofbeats of his paint horse fading into the evening air. Rebecca stood beside her wagon for a long moment, the money clutched in her hand, trying to understand what had just happened. $6.40 would cover the loan interest for this month and next, with enough left over for flour, sugar, and the other supplies she desperately needed. But more than that, something about Xander Garrett had unsettled her in a way she could not quite name. Shaking off the feeling, Rebecca climbed onto the wagon seat and guided her old mare, Daisy, back toward her homestead. The 3-mile journey took nearly an hour, the wagon creaking along the rutted road as the sky darkened from gold to purple to deep blue. By the time Rebecca reached her property, stars were beginning to prick through the twilight. The homestead consisted of a small cabin, a barn in desperate need of repair, a chicken coop, and several acres of land that Rebecca had been struggling to maintain alone. Thomas had purchased the property with dreams of building something grand, but his death had left those dreams as scattered as autumn leaves. Still, Rebecca had refused to give up. She had sold off the cattle they had owned, keeping only Daisy and the chickens, and had focused her energy on the fruit trees Thomas had planted in their first year of marriage, and the wild berry patches she had cultivated along the creek that marked the eastern boundary of her land. That night, Rebecca lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie, the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. But her thoughts kept returning to gray-blue eyes and a deep voice with a Texas drawl. She told herself she was being foolish. Xander Garrett was likely just a cowboy passing through, generous with his money because he could afford to be. She would probably never see him again. Thursday came around again with the relentless certainty of the seasons. Rebecca had spent the week making another large batch of preserves, working from dawn to dusk to have enough jars ready. She had also made repairs to the chicken coop, tended her garden, and done 100 other tasks that came with maintaining a homestead alone. Her hands were rougher than ever, 2 fingernails broken, but she had 38 jars of preserves loaded into her wagon as she drove into Riverside under a clear autumn sky. She set up in the same spot as before, arranging her jars with care. The morning passed slowly with a handful of sales, and Rebecca tried not to watch the road for a paint horse and its rider. She told herself it did not matter whether Xander Garrett appeared or not. Her preserves would sell regardless. But when the afternoon sun reached its zenith, and she heard the now familiar sound of hooves on packed dirt, her heart betrayed her by skipping a beat. Xander Garrett rode into view, sitting tall in his saddle, and Rebecca felt an inexplicable warmth spread through her chest. He dismounted and approached her table, his expression neutral but his eyes bright with something that might have been pleasure. "Good afternoon, Miss Crawford." "Good afternoon, Mr. Garrett," Rebecca replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "You have returned. I said I would." He surveyed the jars laid out before him. "And you have been busy, I see. A woman with a homestead to keep cannot afford to be idle." Xander picked up a jar of plum preserves, holding it up to the light just as he had done the previous week. "How many jars do you have today?" Rebecca's pulse quickened. 38. "I will take them all," he said simply, already reaching for his wallet. "Mr. Garrett," Rebecca protested, though her hand was already calculating the sum in her head, $7.60. "Surely you cannot need so many preserves. You have not even had time to consume the jars you bought last week." "Who says I consumed them?" Xander met her eyes with an expression that was almost challenging. "Perhaps I am stocking up for winter." "Winter is still months away, and these preserves, while they keep well, are meant to be enjoyed." "Then perhaps I am giving them away," he said, placing $8 on the table. "Keep the change, Miss Crawford. Your work is worth more than 20 cents a jar." Rebecca stared at the money, her pride warring with her need. "I cannot accept charity, Mr. Garrett. It is not charity, it is a fair price for a superior product." His voice was gentle but firm. "Please, Miss Crawford, allow me to purchase your preserves." There was something in the way he said it, a sincerity that made Rebecca believe he truly wanted to buy them, not out of pity but out of genuine desire. She nodded slowly, taking the money with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you." They loaded the jars into his saddlebags and a pack he had brought specifically for the purpose, working in companionable silence. When they finished, Xander did not immediately leave. Instead, he leaned against the hitching post, his posture relaxed. "How far is your homestead from town?" he asked. "About 3 miles east along the river road." "That is a long journey to make alone every week." Rebecca bristled slightly. "I am accustomed to doing things alone, Mr. Garrett. I have managed for 2 years now." "I did not mean to offend," Xander said quickly. "I only meant that the road can be dangerous. There are outlaws operating in the territory, and a woman traveling alone makes an easy target." "I carry a rifle," Rebecca replied, though in truth the old Winchester under her wagon seat had not been fired in months, and she was not entirely certain it would work properly if needed. Xander studied her for a long moment. "Would you object to company on your journey home?" "I am heading in that direction anyway." Rebecca knew she should refuse. It was improper to travel alone with a man she barely knew. But something about Xander Garrett made her feel safe rather than threatened, and the truth was that the road could be dangerous. 2 weeks prior, she had heard about a woman who had been robbed while traveling from town. "I would not object," she heard herself say. The ride back to the homestead was unlike any journey Rebecca had made in the past 2 years. Xander rode alongside her wagon, keeping his pace matched to Daisy's plodding walk. He spoke of his work, explaining that he was a cattle buyer who traveled between ranches and railheads, negotiating purchases and arranging shipments. It was work that kept him moving, he said, but he was considering settling down somewhere in Kansas or perhaps Nebraska. Rebecca found herself telling him about the homestead, about Thomas's dreams and her determination to keep the property despite the challenges. She spoke of her preserves, how the recipes had been passed down from her mother, and how making them connected her to a past that sometimes felt very distant. Xander listened with an attention that was almost startling, asking thoughtful questions and seeming genuinely interested in her answers. When they reached the turnoff to her property, Xander insisted on riding up to the cabin to ensure she arrived safely. As they approached, Rebecca saw the homestead through his eyes, the small cabin with its patched roof, the leaning barn, the modest chicken coop, the fruit trees that were her pride and joy, and felt a familiar mixture of pride and defensiveness. "It is not much," she said as she set the brake on the wagon, "but it is mine." Xander dismounted and walked around the property with a practiced eye. "You have good land here, Miss Crawford. That creek provides reliable water and your soil looks fertile. With some work, this could be a fine homestead." "With some work and money I do not have," Rebecca said, more sharply than she intended. "Perhaps," Xander agreed mildly. He helped her unload the supplies she had purchased in town, carrying the heavy flour sack as though it weighed nothing. When everything was stacked on her porch, he lingered for a moment, his hat in his hands. "Miss Crawford, I wonder if I might ask you a question that may be too forward." Rebecca's heart began to pound. "You may ask. Would you object if I called on you?" "Not for preserves, though I will certainly continue to buy those, but to call on you properly, as a gentleman calls on a lady he would like to know better." The directness of the question stunned Rebecca into silence. She stared at Xander, searching his face for signs of mockery or ulterior motive, but found only honest interest and a vulnerability that made him suddenly more human and less like the confident cowboy he had first appeared to be. "Why?" she finally asked. You know nothing about me, Mr. Garrett. I am a widow with debts and a failing homestead. I have nothing to offer a gentleman caller. You have yourself to offer, Xander said quietly. And from what I have seen, Miss Crawford, that is considerable. You are hardworking, skilled, resilient, and you face the world with a courage I find admirable. I would like the opportunity to know you better, if you would grant me that privilege. Rebecca felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such respect, had seen her as more than a struggling widow to be pitied or dismissed. "Yes," she said softly. "You may call on me, Mr. Garrett." The smile that spread across Xander's face transformed it entirely, making him look younger and lighting up his eyes. "Then I will return on Sunday afternoon, if that is acceptable." Sunday would be fine. Xander replaced his hat and mounted his horse in one smooth motion. "Until Sunday, then, Miss Crawford." Rebecca watched him ride away until he disappeared from view, then sank down on the porch steps, her legs suddenly weak. What had she done? She had agreed to let a strange man court her, a man she had met only twice. But even as her practical mind listed all the reasons this was foolish, her heart whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, something good might come of this. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of autumn day that made the prairie seem to glow with golden light. Rebecca woke early, despite having barely slept from nervousness, and set about making her cabin presentable. She swept the floors, dusted every surface, and arranged wildflowers in a jar on the table. She baked bread using precious flour, telling herself that if Xander did not come, she would eat it herself and not feel foolish at all. She changed her dress 3 times, finally settling on her best calico, a blue print that brought out the color of her eyes. She brushed her hair until it shone, then pinned it up in a softer style than her usual severe bun. When she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin, she barely recognized herself. There was color in her cheeks and a brightness in her eyes that had been absent for 2 years. Xander arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, riding up to the cabin with a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and his hat in the other. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance as well, wearing a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair neatly combed. When Rebecca stepped out onto the porch, his face lit up with that transformative smile. "Miss Crawford, you look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Garrett." "And thank you for the flowers." She took the bouquet, their fingers brushing briefly, and felt a spark of electricity at the contact. "Would you like to come inside? I have made bread and coffee." They sat at her small table, and Rebecca poured coffee from her battered pot, wishing she had finer things to offer. But Xander seemed genuinely pleased, complimenting her bread and asking about the wildflowers she had picked. The conversation flowed more easily than Rebecca had expected, and she found herself relaxing in his presence. Xander spoke of his life, filling in details he had omitted during their previous conversations. He had been born in Texas, raised on a ranch until his parents died when he was 17. He had worked as a cowboy for various outfits, driving cattle up the long trails to Kansas railheads, before discovering he had a knack for buying and selling. The work paid well, he explained, but it was lonely. "I have been thinking it is time to put down roots," he said, cradling his coffee cup in his large hands. "To find a place to call home and perhaps start a family. A man can only drift for so long before he realizes he is drifting away from life rather than toward anything meaningful." "And why Riverside?" Rebecca asked. "Of all the towns in Kansas, why settle here?" Xander was quiet for a moment, his gray-blue eyes studying her face. "Honestly, because I met a woman selling preserves on a dusty street, and something about her made me think that perhaps this was the place I had been looking for without knowing it." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Rebecca felt her breath catch, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Garrett, that is quite a statement to make after 2 meetings. Call me Xander, please. And you are right, it is a bold statement, but I have learned that life is short and uncertain. When you find something that feels right, you should not hesitate to pursue it." "And you think I might be that something?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you might be," Xander agreed. "But I also know that you have no reason to trust me yet, and I do not expect you to. I am simply asking for the chance to prove myself worthy of your consideration." Rebecca looked down at her hands, work roughened and scarred from various injuries sustained while maintaining the homestead. "I am not an easy woman, Xander. I have been hardened by circumstance. I am stubborn and proud, and I do not need rescuing." "I am not offering to rescue you, Rebecca." The sound of her Christian name on his lips made her look up sharply. "I am offering partnership, companionship. I can see you are strong and capable. Those are qualities I admire, not flaws that need correction." They talked until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Xander helped Rebecca with her evening chores, feeding the chickens and checking on the fruit trees with an ease that suggested he was genuinely interested in her work. When it came time for him to leave, he stood on the porch holding his hat, seeming reluctant to go. "May I call on you again?" he asked. "Perhaps next Sunday." "I would like that," Rebecca replied, and realized she meant it with an intensity that surprised her. The following Thursday, Rebecca loaded 45 jars into her wagon, the largest batch yet. She had worked herself to exhaustion making them, but the money from Xander's purchases had allowed her to buy more sugar and jars, enabling her to expand her production. As she drove into Riverside, she felt a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with preserves and everything to do with a certain cowboy. Xander was waiting for her when she arrived, leaning against the hitching post with his horse tied nearby. When he saw her wagon, he straightened and walked over to help her set up. 45 jars, he observed, helping her arrange them on the table. "You have been busy." "I will not assume you want to buy them all this time," Rebecca said, though she could not quite keep the hopeful note from her voice. "You must surely have more preserves than you know what to do with by now." "I will take them all," Xander said, just as he had every time before. "And Rebecca, I want to tell you something. I have been giving the preserves away to families who are struggling. There is a widow with 3 children on the edge of town who was grateful for the nutrition. There is an elderly couple whose crops failed this year. There is a young family who just arrived, hoping to homestead, who needed supplies." Rebecca stared at him, her throat tight with emotion. "You bought my preserves to give them away. I bought them because they are excellent and because you needed the money. What I do with them afterward is my business." Xander's expression was gentle. "But yes, I have been sharing them. I hope that does not upset you." "Upset me?" Rebecca felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Xander Garrett, you are the kindest man I have ever met." He reached out tentatively and brushed away her tears with his thumb, his touch gentle. "Do not cry, Rebecca, please. These are happy tears," she managed, laughing through them. "I am not sad, I am just overwhelmed by your generosity." "Our generosity," Xander corrected. "You made the preserves. I am simply the means by which they reach people who need them." They loaded the jars into the packs Xander had brought, and once again he insisted on escorting her home. As they traveled the familiar road, Rebecca found herself telling him about the struggles of the week, the fence that needed mending and the roof that leaked when it rained. Xander listened and offered advice born of years of ranch work, suggesting practical solutions she could implement on her limited budget. When they reached her homestead, Xander surprised her by asking if he might come back the next day to help with the fence. "I have the day free," he explained. "And fence mending is better done with two people." Rebecca's pride warred with her practical need. "I cannot pay you for your labor. I am not asking for payment. I am offering help to someone I care about." The simple statement made Rebecca's heart skip. "You care about me." "I do," Xander said, meeting her eyes steadily. "Very much, if I am being honest." "Then yes," Rebecca said softly. "I would appreciate your help with the fence." Xander arrived the next morning with tools and fresh wooden posts strapped to his saddle. They worked side by side throughout the day, repairing the fence that enclosed Rebecca's garden and chicken yard. The physical labor was hard, but Rebecca found she enjoyed working alongside Xander. He was patient and thorough, taking time to teach her better techniques for setting posts and stretching wire. As they worked, they talked about everything and nothing: childhood memories, dreams for the future, opinions on everything from the best way to train horses to whether the railroad was ultimately good or bad for Kansas towns. Rebecca found herself laughing more than she had in years, and she noticed Xander watching her with an expression that made her feel warm and cherished. They finished as the sun was setting, standing back to admire their work. The fence stood straight and strong, a tangible improvement to the homestead. "Thank you," Rebecca said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "This would have taken me a week to do alone, and it would not have been done half as well." "It was my pleasure," Xander replied. He hesitated, then added, "Rebecca, I know we have not known each other long, but I want you to know that my intentions are serious. I am not a man who plays with a woman's affections. I am courting you because I believe we could build something real together." Rebecca's heart pounded. "Xander, I feel the same, but I am afraid. After Thomas died, I built walls around my heart. I had to in order to survive. And now you are asking me to let those walls down, and that terrifies me." Xander stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. "I understand fear. But I promise you, Rebecca, I will not hurt you if I can help it. I will be patient. We can take this as slowly as you need." "And if I tell you that slowly is not what I want," Rebecca heard herself say, surprised by her own boldness, "that I am tired of being afraid and alone." "Then I would say I feel the same," Xander said, his voice rough with emotion. "Rebecca, may I kiss you?" In answer, Rebecca stepped forward and tilted her face up to his. Xander cupped her cheek with one hand, his touch gentle despite his calloused palm, and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet, filled with promise rather than demand, and Rebecca felt something inside her chest crack open, letting light flood into places that had been dark for too long. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Xander rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her face. "I am falling in love with you," he whispered. "I know it is too soon to say such things, but I cannot keep it inside anymore." "It is not too soon," Rebecca whispered back, "because I am falling in love with you too." The weeks that followed were the happiest Rebecca had known since before Thomas's death. Xander became a fixture at her homestead, visiting several times a week to help with various projects. He repaired the barn roof, fixed the chicken coop door, and helped Rebecca harvest and preserve the last of the autumn fruit. In between the work, there were stolen kisses and long conversations that lasted until the stars came out. Rebecca continued to make her preserves, and Xander continued to buy them, though now he also helped her make larger batches. He had a good business mind and suggested ways she could expand her operation, perhaps selling to the general store or even shipping jars to larger towns. With his encouragement and the steady income from his purchases, Rebecca began to believe that her homestead might actually survive and even thrive. The people of Riverside noticed the courtship, of course. In a small town, little stayed secret for long. There were whispers and speculations, and Rebecca endured more than one conversation with well-meaning women who wanted to know Xander's intentions. But for the most part, the townspeople seemed pleased. Xander had made himself well-liked by his generous purchases and his courteous manner, and everyone agreed that Rebecca Crawford deserved some happiness after her years of struggle. Howard Finch, the banker, was less pleased. He had been counting on Rebecca defaulting on her loan so he could acquire her property, which bordered his own land. When Rebecca paid off 3 months of interest in advance, thanks to the money from her preserve sales, Finch's displeasure was evident. "This is only delaying the inevitable, Mrs. Crawford," he said when she visited his office. "You cannot keep up with these payments indefinitely." "Perhaps not," Rebecca replied coolly, "but I can keep them up for now, which is what matters." When she told Xander about the encounter, his face darkened. "How much do you owe Finch?" "The original loan was $300. With interest, I now owe nearly $400. It might as well be $4,000 for all my ability to pay it." Xander was quiet for a long moment. "Rebecca, I have savings. I could pay off that loan." "No," Rebecca said immediately, her pride flaring. "I will not take your money, Xander. I appreciate the offer, but I need to do this myself." "Why? Why must you do everything alone when there are people who want to help you?" "Because if I do not do it myself, then I have not truly kept my homestead. I will have just traded one man's support for another's." "Is that how you see me?" Xander asked, his voice tight. "As just another man trying to control you?" "No," Rebecca said quickly, reaching for his hand. "That is not what I meant. Xander, you have been nothing but respectful. But this is something I need to do. Please try to understand." Xander pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I do understand. But Rebecca, there is no shame in accepting help, and when two people love each other, they share burdens." "When two people are married, perhaps," Rebecca said without thinking, then felt her face flame. "I did not mean to presume." "You are not presuming," Xander interrupted, pulling back to look into her eyes. "Rebecca Crawford, I had planned to court you properly for at least a few more months before asking, but since you have brought up the subject, I might as well speak plainly. I want to marry you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and work beside you every day and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to help you build this homestead into something prosperous. I want to have children with you if we are blessed with them. I want to spend my life with you." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. "I want all of those things too. But Xander, I cannot marry you while I am in debt. I will not bring that burden into our marriage. Let me find a way to settle with Finch first. Then we can talk about the future." "At least let me help you make that happen faster," Xander pleaded. "Let me become a partner in your preserve business. I can invest money to expand production and we can split the profits. That way you are not accepting charity, you are accepting a business arrangement." Rebecca considered this. It was a solution that preserved her pride while still allowing her to benefit from Xander's resources. "Partners," she said slowly. "Equal partners with equal say in decisions." "Equal partners," Xander agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. With Xander's investment, Rebecca's preserve business expanded rapidly. They purchased more jars and supplies in bulk, saving money. Xander used his connections to arrange sales to several general stores in neighboring towns, and the orders began to pour in. Rebecca worked harder than ever, but now she had help. Xander hired a young woman named Lily from town to assist with the preserve making, and together the three of them produced jars by the dozen. By December, Rebecca had saved enough money to pay off half of her debt to Howard Finch. The banker's face was sour when she handed him the payment, but he could not refuse to accept it and provide a receipt. Rebecca left his office feeling lighter than she had in years. That evening, as she and Xander sat by the fire in her cabin, she broached the subject that had been on her mind for weeks. "I think I am ready," she said softly. Xander looked up from the ledger he had been reviewing. "Ready for what?" "To accept your proposal, if it is still on offer." Xander set down the ledger and crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling Rebecca to her feet and into his arms. "It is always on offer. Are you saying yes? You will marry me?" "Yes," Rebecca breathed. "Yes, I will marry you, Xander Garrett." The kiss that followed was deep and passionate, full of the desire they had been restraining for months. When they finally broke apart, both were flushed and breathing hard. "When?" Xander asked, resting his forehead against hers. "Please say soon." "As soon as we can arrange it." "I do not want a big wedding, just something simple with a few friends as witnesses." "We could marry next week," Xander suggested. "The preacher in Riverside would perform the ceremony. We could invite a few people, have a small celebration here at the homestead." "Next week," Rebecca agreed, joy bubbling up inside her. "That sounds perfect." They were married on a cold but clear December afternoon, standing in the small church in Riverside with a handful of friends and townspeople in attendance. Rebecca wore a simple dress she had made herself, pale blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. Xander wore his best suit, his dark hair combed back, his eyes shining with love and pride as he watched Rebecca walk up the aisle. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed Rebecca with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Afterward, they hosted a small gathering at the homestead, serving hot cider and the bread and preserves that had brought them together. As the sun set and their guests departed, Rebecca stood on the porch of her cabin, now their cabin, and watched the last wagon disappear down the road. Xander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "Happy, Mrs. Garrett," he murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Rebecca replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for seeing past my walls and my pride to the woman underneath." "Thank you for letting me in," Xander countered. "Thank you for taking a chance on a drifting cowboy who bought too many preserves." They kissed as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. And then Xander swept Rebecca into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their home, closing the door on the cold December night. The months that followed were filled with hard work and deep contentment. Xander proved to be everything Rebecca could have hoped for in a husband, a true partner who valued her opinions and respected her abilities. Together, they made decisions about the homestead and the preserve business, which continued to grow steadily. In January, Rebecca paid off the remainder of her debt to Howard Finch, marching into his office with the final payment and the satisfaction of seeing his disappointed face. The homestead was truly hers now, hers and Xander's, free and clear. With the debt settled, Xander suggested they invest in improvements to the property. They hired workers to build a new barn, larger and sturdier than the old one. They purchased several cows and a bull, starting a small herd. Xander continued his cattle buying business, but now he worked from a base at the homestead rather than constantly traveling, making short trips when necessary, but always returning home to Rebecca. In March, Rebecca began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Xander, choosing a quiet evening when they were sitting together by the fire. When she whispered the news, Xander's face transformed with joy. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of spun glass, and she could feel him trembling with emotion. "A baby," he whispered. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Rebecca asked, though she could see the answer on his face. Happy does not begin to cover it, Xander replied. Rebecca, you have given me everything. A home, a partnership, love, and now a child. I am the most fortunate man alive. I think we are both fortunate, Rebecca said softly. We found each other when we both needed someone most. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Rebecca continued to work, though Xander and Lily insisted on taking over the heavier tasks. The preserve business continued to thrive, and they hired another helper, a young man named Timothy who showed a genuine interest in learning the business. In November, as the first snows of winter began to fall, Rebecca went into labor. Xander sent Timothy racing to town to fetch the midwife, while he stayed by Rebecca's side, holding her hand through the contractions and murmuring words of encouragement. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Xander feared for Rebecca's life, but she was as strong in childbirth as she was in everything else. When dawn broke over the prairie, a baby's cry filled the cabin. The midwife placed a squalling, red-faced infant in Rebecca's arms, and she looked down at her son with wonder and exhaustion. "A boy," she whispered, counting his tiny fingers and toes. "Xander, we have a son." Xander knelt beside the bed, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and child. "He is perfect. You are perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas after Rebecca's first husband, a gesture that Xander insisted upon despite Rebecca's protests. "Thomas was part of your life and your journey," Xander said firmly. "He deserves to be honored, and perhaps some part of his dreams lives on in this child and in this homestead that you fought so hard to keep." Little Thomas proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby with his mother's auburn hair and his father's gray-blue eyes. He brought a new dimension of joy to the homestead, his presence seeming to bless everything they did. The preserve business continued to grow, their cattle herd expanded, and the homestead became more prosperous with each passing season. 2 years later, Rebecca gave birth again, this time to a daughter they named Mary after Rebecca's mother. Mary had dark hair like her father and a sunny disposition that lit up every room she entered. Xander proved to be a devoted father, spending hours playing with his children and telling them stories of his cowboy days. The homestead that had once seemed on the verge of failure now thrived. The cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, and additional buildings were constructed for the preserve business, which had become so successful that Rebecca now employed 6 people full-time. The jars of preserves that bore the label Crawford Garrett Preserves, Riverside, Kansas, were sold throughout the state and even shipped as far as Missouri and Nebraska. Rebecca sometimes thought back to that day when she had stood on the dusty street of Riverside, exhausted and desperate, selling her preserves to keep her homestead. She remembered the moment Xander Garrett had walked into her life, tall and confident, offering to buy all her jars with a generosity that had seemed almost too good to be true. "What made you do it?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while their children played in the yard. "That first day when you bought all my preserves, did you know then that you wanted to court me?" Xander was quiet for a moment, his arm around her shoulders. "I knew there was something special about you. The way you stood there, so proud and strong despite your circumstances. The care you had taken with your preserves, the quality of your work. And your eyes, Rebecca. You had the saddest, most determined eyes I had ever seen. I wanted to ease that sadness. I wanted to be the reason those eyes smiled again." "You did that," Rebecca said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You bought more than my preserves, Xander. You bought hope when I had almost run out of it, and in doing so you gave me back my life." "We gave each other life," Xander corrected. "I was drifting, remember? Lonely and searching for something I could not name. You gave me a home, a purpose, a family. You gave me love." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as young Thomas chased Mary around the yard, her laughter ringing out across the prairie. In the distance, the creek that marked their property boundary sparkled in the evening light, and the fruit trees that had been saplings when Rebecca first came to the homestead now stood tall and mature, heavy with the promise of next year's harvest. "You ever regret it?" Rebecca asked. "Taking on a widow with debts and a failing homestead. You could have had an easier life." "Never," Xander said firmly, turning to kiss her temple. "You and this life we have built together are worth every challenge we have faced, and Rebecca, your homestead was never failing. You were making it work against all odds through sheer determination and skill. All I did was recognize what you had already accomplished and offer to be part of it." "You are too generous with your praise," Rebecca protested, but she was smiling. "And you are too hard on yourself," Xander countered. "You are an extraordinary woman, Rebecca Garrett. You always have been." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Xander called the children inside for supper. They gathered around the table, now large enough to accommodate their growing family, and bowed their heads as Xander said grace. Looking at her husband and children, at the home they had built together, Rebecca felt a profound sense of gratitude and peace. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new blessings and new challenges. The preserve business expanded further, and eventually, Rebecca and Xander opened a small shop in Riverside where they sold not only preserves, but also other goods produced by local homesteaders. It became a community gathering place, and Rebecca found deep satisfaction in helping other struggling families the way Xander had once helped her. Thomas grew into a strong, intelligent boy who showed his father's head for business and his mother's determination. Mary was creative and warm-hearted, with a gift for bringing people together. In time, 2 more children joined the family, another boy named Daniel and a girl named Sarah, each one adding their own unique joy to the household. The homestead that Thomas Crawford had once dreamed of building became a reality under Rebecca and Xander's stewardship. The cattle herd grew to several dozen head. The preserve business became one of the most successful enterprises in Riverside. The cabin was eventually replaced by a larger house, built with care and designed to last for generations. But more than the physical prosperity, it was the love that filled that house that made it a true home. Rebecca and Xander's marriage remained strong through the years, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared dreams, and a deep, abiding affection that only grew stronger with time. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xander surprised Rebecca by taking her back to Riverside, to the exact spot where she had stood selling preserves that fateful day when they met. He had arranged for someone to watch the children, and he and Rebecca stood together on the dusty street as the afternoon sun slanted down just as it had a decade before. "You remember?" Xander asked, holding both of her hands in his. "I remember everything," Rebecca replied. "I remember thinking I was at the end of my rope. I remember how tired I was, how scared. And then you appeared like something out of a dream, and you bought all my preserves. Best purchase I ever made," Xander said with a grin. "Those jars of preserves bought me a lifetime with the woman I love." "And they kept my homestead," Rebecca added, "which became our homestead, which became our home. We have built a good life, Rebecca. We have built a beautiful life," Rebecca corrected. "And it all started here, with jars of preserves and a cowboy who was kind enough to see past a struggling widow to the woman beneath." Xander pulled her close, kissing her deeply right there on the main street of Riverside, not caring who might see. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "I love you, Rebecca Garrett," Xander said. "I loved you then when you were proud and struggling. I love you now when you are successful and confident. I will love you always." "And I love you, Xander Garrett," Rebecca replied. "You bought my preserves. You bought my heart. And in doing so, you saved my life in every way that matters." They stood together on that dusty street, holding each other as the sun set over Riverside, Kansas. Two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, and had built something lasting and true from that first unlikely encounter. The preserve business continued for many years, eventually being passed down to their children and then to their grandchildren. The Crawford Garrett name became synonymous with quality and integrity throughout Kansas and beyond. But more than a business, it represented a legacy of love, determination, and the belief that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms from unexpected people. Rebecca never forgot those dark days when she had struggled alone, desperately making preserves to keep her homestead. The memory kept her humble and compassionate, always willing to help others who found themselves in difficult circumstances. She and Xander became known for their generosity, often providing interest-free loans to struggling homesteaders or buying goods from those who needed the income. When Howard Finch fell on hard times years later, his bank failing due to poor investments, it was Rebecca and Xander who bought his property, ensuring he had enough money to live comfortably in his old age. It was an act of grace that surprised many in Riverside, but Rebecca simply said that she remembered what it felt like to be desperate and would not wish that feeling on anyone. As they grew older, Rebecca and Xander spent many evenings on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the prairie they had learned to love. They would hold hands and talk about their children and grandchildren, about the changes they had seen in Kansas as it transformed from wild frontier to settled farmland, about the life they had built together. "Did you ever imagine this?" Rebecca asked one evening when they were both well into their 60s. "When you bought those first jars of preserves, did you imagine we would have all of this?" Xander considered the question seriously. "I imagined possibility," he finally said. "I saw a woman who refused to give up, who worked with skill and care, who had the strength to stand alone but deserved a partner to stand with her. I imagined that if I could be that partner, we might build something good together. But this—" He gestured to the prosperous homestead, to the house filled with the sounds of visiting grandchildren, to the life they had created. "This exceeds anything I could have imagined." "I had given up on happiness," Rebecca admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought my life would be nothing but survival. Just getting through each day, trying to keep the homestead, trying to honor his memory by not failing. And then you came along and reminded me that life could be more than just survival, that I could be more than just a widow fighting to hold on." "You were always more than that," Xander said gently. "You just needed someone to help you remember." Their children often asked them to tell the story of how they met, and it became a family legend, the tale of the widow who sold preserves and the cowboy who bought them all. The younger grandchildren would listen with wide eyes as Rebecca described those difficult days, and as Xander explained how he had seen immediately that Rebecca was special. "But why did you buy all the preserves, Grandpa?" one of the grandchildren asked. "That is a lot of preserves for one person." "Because I saw your grandmother standing there, trying so hard to save her home, and I wanted to help," Xander explained. "But more than that, I saw a woman I wanted to know better, and buying those preserves gave me a reason to come back and see her again." "It was very romantic," the child said approvingly. "It was very strategic," Xander replied with a wink at Rebecca. "I had to convince your grandmother to give me a chance. She is a stubborn woman." "I prefer determined," Rebecca interjected, and the whole family laughed. As the years advanced, Rebecca and Xander remained devoted to each other. When Xander's health began to fail in his 70s, Rebecca nursed him with the same determination she had once applied to keeping her homestead. And when Rebecca developed a persistent cough that worried everyone, Xander insisted on bringing in the best doctors available, sparing no expense. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, a testament to the family they had created together. The celebration was held at the Homestead, now one of the most prosperous in all of Kansas, and people came from miles around to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. During the celebration, their eldest son Thomas stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but an action. That partnership means supporting each other through challenges. That determination and hard work can create something lasting. And that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected encounters." Everyone raised their glasses, and Rebecca looked at Xander with tears in her eyes. He squeezed her hand, his own eyes wet, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was, that they had been blessed beyond measure, that their gamble on each other had paid off in ways neither could have predicted. They lived several more years, remaining in their home on the homestead they had built together. When Xander finally passed away at the age of 78, he died peacefully in his sleep with Rebecca holding his hand. His last words were, "I love you, my beautiful wife. Thank you for saying yes to a cowboy who bought too many preserves." Rebecca mourned deeply, but without despair. She had learned long ago that grief was the price of love, and she would not trade a single day of the life she had shared with Xander to avoid the pain of losing him. She continued to live at the homestead, surrounded by family, and often visited the spot in Riverside where she and Xander had first met, remembering the day that had changed her life. She lived to be 82, spending her final years sharing stories with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, ensuring that the legacy she and Xander had built would continue. When she passed away, also peacefully in her sleep, her family laid her to rest beside Xander in the small cemetery on the edge of Riverside, under a stone that read, "Rebecca Crawford Garrett, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother." She sold preserves to keep her homestead and found love in the bargain. The homestead remained in the family for generations, a testament to the determination of a widow who had refused to give up and the love of a cowboy who had seen past her circumstances to the extraordinary woman beneath. And in jars of preserves still made according to Rebecca's original recipes, in the stories told around family tables, in the values of hard work and compassion passed down through the generations, Rebecca and Xander's love story continued to live on. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, that a simple act of kindness, like buying all of a struggling widow's preserves, can change the course of two lives, that love can bloom even in the hardest of circumstances, and that when two people find each other and choose to build a life together, they can create something that lasts far beyond their own years. The Crawford Garrett homestead stood for over a century, eventually becoming a historical landmark, a place where people could visit and learn about the early days of Kansas settlement and the remarkable couple who had turned a failing property into a thriving enterprise. The preserve business, though it eventually evolved and modernized, never forgot its roots, and jars still bore the image of a simple wooden table on a dusty street and the words, "Since 1878, made with love in Riverside, Kansas." And so the story of Rebecca and Xander became more than just a family legend. It became part of the fabric of Riverside itself, a reminder that the town had been built not just by the famous gunfighters and cattle barons of Wild West legend, but also by ordinary people like a widow trying to keep her home and a cowboy with a generous heart who had recognized something worth fighting for when he saw it. In the end, it was a simple story but a profound one, a love story that had started with jars of preserves on a dusty street and had blossomed into a legacy that touched countless lives across generations. Rebecca had set out that day to sell preserves to keep her homestead. Xander had bought them all, but in the process, they had bought each other's hearts, and that had made all the difference.